The alarms screamed through the training facility like angry metal birds. In the center arena, 5 young cubs fought against holographic enemies that appeared from thin air. Their scales gleamed under the bright lights, and their crystalline horns caught the glow as they moved. Each cub was the size of a large dog, but they fought with the fury of creatures much bigger. One stood in the observation room, arms crossed, watching through the reinforced glass. He was a human in his early 30s, with tired eyes that had seen too many battles. His uniform was crisp and clean, but his hands bore old scars from years of combat. Next to him, adjusted her, recording the session. "They're so young," said quietly. She was which meant she studied alien life forms. Her job was to understand how different species worked, how they thought, how they lived. "Young by our standards," one replied. "For this is normal. They start combat training at age 3. Below them, 4 of the cubs were doing well. They attacked with precision, their movements sharp and efficient. But the 5th cub, the smallest one, kept hesitating. When a holographic enemy fell and pretended to be wounded, this small cub stopped. It looked at the injured hologram with something that looked almost like concern. Commander, the military leader overseeing the training, roared something in his native language. His voice was like gravel scraping against stone. The small cub flinched and forced itself to attack the wounded hologram. "That one's different," one observed. "Different how?" asked. "Watch its eyes. It doesn't want to hurt things. It has to force itself." The simulation ended. The 4 successful cubs stood proud, their chests heaving with exertion. The small cub stood apart, its head lowered. Commander descended from his platform, his massive form towering over the youngsters. He was easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark red scales that looked like armor. One couldn't hear what was being said, but he didn't need to. The body language told the story, pointed at the small cub, then at the door. The other cubs backed away as if the small one carried a disease. The small cub's shoulders shook. It was crying, one realized, though didn't produce tears. They trembled instead. "I need to go down there," one said suddenly. "One, don't interfere with their customs," warned. "You know how they are about their traditions." But one was already moving toward the door. He took the elevator down to the arena level, his heart beating faster. He didn't know why he felt so strongly about this, but something in his gut told him this mattered. When he entered the arena, the elders were already assembled. There were 5 of them, all massive and from decades of warfare. They stood in judgment while the small cub knelt before them. Commander was speaking in the common galactic language now, which meant he wanted everyone to understand. "This cub has failed the trial. It shows weakness. It shows mercy to enemies. These traits cannot be tolerated in a warrior. The cub is declared unsuitable for the warrior caste and will be reassigned to labor colonies." The small cub made a sound, a high-pitched whine that cut through one's chest like a knife. "Excuse me," one said, stepping forward. His voice was calm but clear. Every head turned toward him. "Human," said, his tone dismissive. "This does not concern your species." "I'm an instructor at this facility," one replied, "and I'm writing a manual on cross-species combat training methodologies. I'd like to request temporary custody of this cub for my research." The elders looked at each other. One of them, an ancient female with gray scales, tilted her head. "What purpose would this serve?" "I want to test alternative training methods. If I succeed, your people gain new tactical options. If I fail, you've lost nothing. The cub is already considered worthless by your standards." His eyes narrowed. "You wish to prove that your soft human methods are superior to our traditions." "I wish to explore options," one said carefully. "Knowledge has value." The elders conferred in their own language, a series of growls and clicks that sounded like rocks being smashed together. Finally, turned back to one. "Very well, take the defective cub. You have 3 months. If it cannot pass our standards by then, it returns to us for reassignment." And human, When you fail, it will prove that weakness can never become strength. One nodded. He approached the small cub who looked up at him with large, golden eyes filled with fear and confusion. "Come with me," one said gently. "It's okay." The cub hesitated, then slowly stood and followed him out of the arena. Behind them, one could hear the elders laughing. They thought this was a joke. They thought he would fail. Maybe he would, but he had to try. Back in his quarters, one set up a small sleeping area for the cub. The creature stood in the corner, trembling, trying to take up as little space as possible. It expected punishment, one realized. It expected pain. "Hey," one said softly, kneeling down to the cub's level. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. My name is One. Can you understand me?" The cub nodded slowly. Most species in the facility had translation implants that allowed basic communication. "Do you have a name?" The cub made a sound that one's implant translated as unworthy. "That's not a name. That's just something mean someone called you." One thought for a moment. "How about I call you Spark? Because I think there's something bright inside you that everyone else missed." The cub, Spark, looked at him with those golden eyes. For the first time, the trembling stopped. Over the next few weeks, one didn't push combat training. Instead, he focused on basics. He taught Spark how to move efficiently, how to observe surroundings, how to think before acting. He offered food without conditions. He answered questions without impatience. And most importantly, he listened. Spark began to relax. The cub started exploring the quarters, asking about human culture, showing curiosity about everything. One discovered that Spark was incredibly intelligent, noticing details that others missed, making connections that seemed obvious once pointed out but weren't apparent at first glance. "You're not weak," one told Spark one evening. They were sitting together, watching the stars through the viewport. "You're just different, and different can be powerful if you learn how to use it." "The others say empathy is weakness," Spark said quietly. "The others are wrong. Empathy is what makes you understand your enemy. Understanding is the first step to victory." One smiled. "My old commander used to say that the most dangerous warrior isn't the strongest or the fastest. It's the one who can predict what you'll do before you do it." "Can you teach me that?" Spark asked. "I can try." 1 month into training, the facility-wide alert drill happened. It was a standard safety procedure, testing how quickly everyone could reach emergency stations. When the alarm sounded, one headed toward the human assembly point. Spark should have gone to the section. But when one looked back, Spark was following him, staying close to his legs. The cub wasn't going to its own people. It was staying with the human who had shown it kindness. They passed other instructors in the corridor. Everyone saw it. A cub, hiding behind a human, trusting the alien instead of its own kind. By the next morning, everyone in the facility was talking about it, and Commander demanded an immediate meeting. The conference room was cold, both in temperature and atmosphere. Commander stood at one end of the long table, his massive arms crossed over his chest. 3 other officers flanked him, their expressions hard as stone. On the opposite side sat one, with beside him for support. Spark waited outside in the hallway, guarded by a junior officer. "You are corrupting the cub," said without preamble. His voice echoed off the metal walls. "It runs to you instead of its own kind. This is unacceptable." "I'm training it," one replied calmly, "as we agreed." "Training?" One of the other officers slammed his fist on the table. "You're making it soft, dependent. This is not the way." One leaned forward. "The way failed Spark. Your traditional methods declared it worthless. I'm trying something different because your approach didn't work." "It didn't work because the cub is defective," growled. "Or maybe," interjected, her voice steady despite the tension, "your definition of defective is wrong. I've been studying Spark's responses and cognitive patterns. This cub has spatial awareness that's 20% better than average. Its pattern recognition is exceptional. and its ability to read emotional states, even across species, is extraordinary. Those traits are useless in combat, said dismissively. Are they? One pulled out his and projected a holographic display onto the table. Last week I ran a simulation. I gave Spark a tactical scenario with multiple enemy positions. Instead of charging in like traditional doctrine teaches, Spark identified the enemy commander by watching movement patterns. One precise strike to take out leadership and the rest of the force surrendered. Total casualties, 1. Time to completion, 4 minutes. The officers stared at the data. I ran the same simulation with one of your top cadets, one continued. Traditional frontal assault, 11 casualties. Time to completion, 18 minutes. Spark won with fewer losses and greater efficiency. His jaw tightened. One simulation proves nothing. Then let me continue training. You gave me 3 months. I've used 1. Give me the remaining 2 and we'll see what happens. The officers conferred in their growling language. Finally, turned back. You have your 2 months, human, but the cub must participate in the grand melee at the end of term. If it fails there, it returns to us. No more delays. One nodded, agreed. After the meeting, one found Spark curled up in the hallway, trying to make itself small. The cub looked up as he approached, fear bright in those golden eyes. Am I going back? Spark asked, voice barely a whisper. One knelt down and placed a hand on the cub's scaled shoulder. Not yet. We've got 2 months to show them what you can really do. Over the following weeks, one's quarters became a hub of quiet activity. He trained Spark using methods that would have made traditional instructors roar with fury. Instead of endless combat drills, they focused on observation. Instead of pure aggression, they practiced controlled responses. Instead of individual glory, they learned teamwork. Visited often, bringing data and insights from her research. She discovered that Spark's crystalline horns could produce subtle frequency vibrations, almost like sonar. With practice, Spark learned to use these vibrations to map surroundings in complete darkness or to disorient opponents without physical contact. Your people never explored this, told Spark one afternoon. They were so focused on using horns as weapons for stabbing that they never considered other applications. Spark experimented eagerly, fascinated by these new discoveries about its own body. The cub's confidence grew slowly, like a plant reaching toward sunlight. But they weren't alone in noticing one's methods. Other trainees began to watch. A young pilot from the species started asking questions about human tactical doctrine. An engineer from requested permission to observe training sessions. And most surprisingly, a junior warrior named Bora began showing up at one's quarters, standing in the doorway, watching but never speaking. You're welcome to join us, one told Bora one evening. The young warrior looked conflicted, his scales shifting color with emotion. Commander would be displeased. Commander isn't here, one said simply. And knowledge is knowledge, it doesn't care about politics. Bora hesitated, then stepped inside. Word spread. Soon, one was conducting informal training sessions with a mixed group of species. They gathered in his quarters after official training hours, learning tactics that emphasized intelligence over brute force, cooperation over competition. The traditional instructors noticed, and they were not pleased. 2 months into the training, the facility commander called an emergency council meeting. One was summoned to appear before representatives from a dozen species. The chamber was enormous, with seats arranged in a semicircle rising up like an amphitheater. One stood in the center, feeling very small and very human. Commander spoke first. This human has undermined traditional training methodologies. He teaches weakness. He corrupts our youth with ideas of mercy and hesitation. I move that he be removed from his position and the defective cub be returned to custody immediately. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some species nodded in agreement, others looked uncertain. Instructor 1, the facility commander said, you may respond. One took a breath. I'm not teaching weakness. I'm teaching adaptation. War isn't about who hits hardest. It's about who survives, who accomplishes the mission, who brings their people home. Every species here has different strengths, has power and endurance, have speed and reflexes, have analytical minds. Humans have adaptability. Why wouldn't we learn from each other? Because diluting our methods dilutes our strength, roared. Does it? One pulled out his again. I've been running comparative analyses. Mixed species units using integrated tactics show a 42% improvement in mission success rates compared to single species units using traditional methods. Casualty rates drop by 37%. These aren't opinions. These are facts. The chamber fell silent. Numbers were hard to argue with. However, one continued, I understand the concern. Traditional methods have kept your species alive I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm saying there might be room for both approaches. To prove this, I accept Commander's condition. Spark will compete in the grand melee. If we fail, I'll resign my position and stop teaching alternative methods. But if we succeed, I ask that the Council consider implementing integrated training as an option, not a replacement. The facility commander, an elderly being from a species that looked like living crystal, leaned forward. This is acceptable. The grand melee begins in 2 weeks. Prepare your student, Instructor 1. That night back in his quarters, one found Spark staring out at the stars. The cub looked bigger now, stronger, more confident than the trembling creature he'd first met. You heard, one asked. I heard, Spark said quietly. If I fail, it's not just me, it's you too. It's all the others who've been learning from you. No pressure, right? One tried to joke, but it fell flat. Spark turned to face him. Why are you doing this? Why risk so much for me? One sat down next to the cub, choosing his words carefully. When I was young, I was told I was too soft to be a soldier, too emotional, too concerned about casualties. My instructors said I'd get people killed. But during the Titan Belt campaign, my unit was trapped behind enemy lines. Traditional tactics said to fight our way out. I suggested we observe enemy patrol patterns, wait for a gap, and slip through. My commander was desperate enough to try it. All 23 of us made it home without firing a shot. Sometimes the unconventional choice is the right choice. And you think I'm an unconventional choice. I think you're a reminder that different isn't defective. It's just different. And sometimes different saves lives. Spark was quiet for a long moment. Then the cub moved closer, leaning against one side. I won't let you down. I know you won't, one said, putting his arm around the young. Because you're not fighting to prove them wrong anymore. You're fighting to prove yourself right. The training arena had been transformed. Holographic environments flickered across every surface, creating jungles, deserts, space stations, and urban warfare zones. Hundreds of trainees from dozens of species filled the preparation areas, each wearing their unit colors. The Grand Melee was the most important event of the training year. Success here meant everything. Failure meant shame. Spark stood in the human section, wearing a light combat harness that one had designed specifically for the cub's smaller frame. The young looked nervous but determined. Around them, other trainees stared. Some whispered. Some laughed. The smallest cub, trained by a human, competing against warriors twice its size. Remember what we practiced, one said quietly, checking Spark's equipment one final time. Speed over strength. Observation over aggression. Think 3 moves ahead. I remember, Spark said, but the cub's voice trembled slightly. Arrived with last-minute data on there. I've analyzed the likely opponents. 3 warrior cadets, 2 pilots, and a heavy fighter, all of them trained traditionally. Good, one said. That means they'll be predictable. The announcement echoed through the arena. All participants to starting positions. Day 1 competition begins in 5 minutes. Individual combat trials. Spark moved toward the entrance tunnel. Before leaving, the cub looked back at one. The human gave a small nod of encouragement. You've got this, one said. The first day was brutal. Individual combat meant one-on-one fights until only the top 16 remained. Spark's first opponent was a pilot, all speed and sharp reflexes. The crowd expected the cub to use traditional tactics, to charge in with horns lowered and claws extended. Instead, Spark circled, watched, waited. The struck first fast as lightning, but Spark had already moved, using that exceptional spatial awareness to predict exactly where the attack would land. A quick sidestep, a precise strike to this exposed flank, and it was over in seconds. The crowd fell silent. That wasn't how fought, that was something different. Spark's second opponent was another, bigger and stronger. This one knew traditional techniques intimately. It charged with overwhelming force. Spark didn't try to match strength with strength. Instead, the cub used the environment, leading the opponent into a narrow corridor where size became a disadvantage. Horn vibrations disoriented the larger fighter just enough for Spark to slip behind and land a disabling blow. By the end of day one, Spark had advanced to the final 16. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't just the victories. It was how Spark fought. Every opponent was disabled, never seriously injured. Every fight ended with Spark checking if the opponent was okay. The mercy that had once been called weakness was now visible to everyone. In the observation room, Commander watched with an unreadable expression. Beside him, the ancient female elder, High Mother Al, leaned forward with interest. "The cub fights strangely," one of the younger officers commented. "Strange, yes," Al said softly, "but also familiar, like something from old stories." Day 2 brought team tactics. Trainees were assigned to mixed groups and given complex objectives. Spark ended up with 3 beings, and a nervous young named Tessa who had also been watching one's training sessions. Their objective was to retrieve a data core from a heavily defended position. Other teams immediately began planning assault strategies, focusing on firepower and frontal attacks. Spark's team gathered in their planning area. They looked skeptical. "No offense, little one, but how exactly are you supposed to help? You're half the size of everyone else." "Size isn't everything," Spark said quietly. "Let me scout first. I can use horn vibrations to map the defensive positions without being seen." "That's actually not a bad idea," they admitted. They implemented Spark's plan. While other teams charged in and got down in simulated combat, Spark's team moved like shadows. The cub identified a patrol pattern gap. They slipped through, retrieved the data core, and extracted before most defenders even knew they were there. Mission time 8 minutes, casualties 0. Other teams took over 30 minutes and suffered heavy simulated losses. By day 3, people were noticing patterns. The trainees who had been quietly learning from one were performing exceptionally well. They weren't the strongest or the fastest, but they were efficient. They thought before acting. They adapted to situations instead of forcing situations to adapt to them. The survival scenario on day 3 pushed everyone to their limits. Trainees were dropped into a hostile environment with limited supplies. The simulation included environmental hazards, aggressive wildlife, and dwindling resources. Traditional training said to establish dominance, take what you need, eliminate threats. Spark's group did something different. They found a wounded enemy NPC, a holographic soldier programmed to be hostile. Instead of killing it, Spark convinced the team to treat its injuries. The NPC, following complex AI programming, responded to the mercy. It revealed information about a hidden cache and a safe route through the most dangerous area. Other teams spent hours fighting through hazards. Spark's team walked around them. When the results posted that evening, Spark's team ranked first in efficiency, resource management, and objective completion. The traditional instructors were speechless. But day 4 brought catastrophe. Halfway through a complex infiltration scenario, alarms began screaming. Not simulation alarms, real emergency alarms. A section of the facility's life support had failed. Trainees who were supposed to be in a safe simulation were suddenly in actual danger. Oxygen was dropping. Temperature was falling. Panic erupted. In the observation rooms, instructors scrambled to shut down simulations and evacuate trainees. But the systems weren't responding. Something had gone wrong, badly wrong. Inside the affected zone, 30 trainees faced real danger. Some panicked. Some fought each other for access to emergency oxygen stations. The training doctrine of every species said the same thing: survive first, help others if possible. Spark stood in the center of the chaos and made a choice. Everyone listen. The cub's voice cut through the panic. Horn vibrations amplified the sound, impossible to ignore. Fighting wastes oxygen. We organize, we share. We all survive or none of us do. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Bora, the young warrior who had been watching one's training, stepped forward. The cub is right. Traditional doctrine doesn't work here. Others followed: the pilot, the engineer, even some who had never trained with one but recognized wisdom when they heard it. They organized, shared resources. The smaller beings, including Spark, who needed less oxygen, gave their masks to the larger ones. They worked together to manually override the door locks, getting everyone to safety. When the crisis ended, Medical Officer 1 did a. All 30 trainees had survived. 0 casualties. And Spark had personally saved 3 beings, including one warrior who had mocked the cub during training. That night, investigators discovered the truth. The system failure wasn't an accident. Someone had sabotaged it. Anti-human extremists within the facility staff trying to prove that soft methods got people killed. Instead, they'd proven the opposite. But there was fallout. One was suspended pending investigation. He was escorted from the facility to temporary quarters while authorities sorted through evidence. Spark tried to follow him. Security stopped the cub. The human is in custody. You need to return to quarters. No, Spark said firmly. Cub, you don't have a choice, the security officer said, not unkindly. Commander has ordered you to. Spark bolted. The cub was small and fast, slipping through the security officer's grasp and running after one. Other officers gave chase. They cornered the cub at a junction of 3 corridors. One, hearing the commotion, turned around despite his escort trying to keep him moving. 3 warriors approached to take Spark back. The cub could have run to them. They were the cub's own species, powerful and strong. Safety lay with them. Instead, Spark ran past all of them and pressed against one's legs, trembling but not from fear, from determination. Security cameras captured it all. The image broadcast across every screen in the facility. A small cub, choosing to stand with a human rather than its own kind. Trusting the alien who had shown kindness over the warriors who represented tradition and strength. In that moment, everyone watching understood something profound. Trust couldn't be commanded. It couldn't be bred or beaten into someone. It had to be earned. And this human had earned it completely. The investigation took only 2 days. Security footage clearly showed the saboteurs, 3 facility technicians who belonged to an extremist group that believed human methods were corrupting proper warrior culture. They confessed quickly when confronted with evidence. Their plan had backfired completely. Instead of proving soft methods got people killed, they'd proven that cooperation and empathy saved lives. One was cleared of all charges and reinstated, but the damage was done. Commander and the elders were furious, not at one but at the situation. The image of Spark hiding behind a human had spread across the entire galactic network. Their species looked weak. Their traditions looked questionable. Something had to be done. The facility commander called an emergency meeting. Representatives from every species packed the chamber. One stood in the center again, but this time Spark stood beside him. The cub had refused to be separated. The grand melee has been disrupted, the facility commander announced. However, we cannot end it without conclusion. The delegation has requested a final test, one that will definitively prove which training methodology produces superior results. Commander stood. His massive form radiated barely controlled anger. The Crucible, Instructor 1 and his student will face it together. If they succeed, we acknowledge that alternative methods have value. If they fail, all non-traditional training ends immediately. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. The Crucible was legendary. It was a combat simulation so difficult that even veteran warriors failed it. It was designed for experienced soldiers, not trainees. The AI opponent adapted and learned from every move, becoming more dangerous with each passing moment. "That's not a test," stood up from the observation seats, her voice sharp with anger. "That's an execution. Spark is still a juvenile." "Then the human should not have interfered with training," replied coldly. "He chose to take responsibility for the cub. Now he must prove his methods work under true pressure." One placed a hand on Spark's shoulder. He could feel the cub trembling. "What are the parameters?" he asked calmly. The facility commander looked uncomfortable but continued. "A derelict space station, hostile AI drones and combat mechs. Objective, reach the central core and shut down the system. Time limit, 2 hours. Medical teams will be standing by to prevent fatal injuries, but pain and damage will be real." "And we face this together," one confirmed. "Yes, you are permitted to enter as Spark's partner, since the commanders insist the cub will need protection from its training weakness." One looked down at Spark. The cub looked up at him with those golden eyes, afraid but trusting. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. "I think if we don't do this, everything we've worked for means nothing," Spark said. "And I think I'd rather fail trying with you than succeed by giving up." One smiled. "Then we accept." They had 1 day to prepare, provided detailed analysis of the simulation's patterns from previous attempts. Most teams tried to fight their way through directly, using overwhelming force. Most teams failed. The AI learned too quickly, adapted too well. Brute strength wasn't enough. "Then we don't use brute strength," one said, studying the station schematics. "We use what we're good at: observation, adaptation, thinking ahead." That night Bora visited their quarters. The young warrior looked troubled. "I want to help, but I don't know how." "You already have," one told him. "You stood up during the crisis. You showed others that there's another way. That matters more than you know. If you fail tomorrow, Commander will shut down everything you've built." "Then we won't fail," Spark said with more confidence than the cub probably felt. The next morning, the entire facility gathered to watch. Every screen broadcast the simulation feed. This was more than a test now. It was a statement about the future of military training across the galaxy. One and Spark entered the simulation chamber. The world dissolved around them, replaced by the cold metal corridors of an abandoned space station. Emergency lights flickered. Somewhere in the distance, mechanical sounds echoed. The AI was waiting. "Remember the plan," one whispered. "We don't fight unless we have to. We observe, we adapt, we think." They moved carefully through the corridors. The first wave of drones appeared, small flying machines with weapons. Traditional tactics said to shoot them down. Instead, Spark used horn vibrations to scramble their communications. The drones began attacking each other, confused and unable to coordinate. "Smart," one said, impressed. They slipped past while the drones were distracted. The second obstacle was a large combat mech, heavily armored and programmed to kill. It spotted them and opened fire. One pulled Spark into cover behind a support pillar. "Can't scramble that one," Spark said. "Too well shielded." "Then we go around." One spotted a maintenance shaft. It would be tight, but they could fit. The mech couldn't. They crawled through the cramped space, emerging 2 levels above their starting point. The mech was still searching for them below, its sensors focused on ground level. As they progressed deeper into the station, the challenges increased. The AI was learning, adapting to their tactics. It began blocking off alternative routes. It anticipated their movements. Halfway through, they encountered something unexpected. Holographic civilians, they weren't targets. They were test elements, part of the simulation's complexity. The AI tracked moral choices. The civilians were wounded, crying for help. Helping them would waste precious time and expose one and Spark to danger. Every previous team had ignored them. Mission first. Casualties were acceptable. Spark stopped looking at the holograms. Even knowing they weren't real, the Cub's empathy kicked in. "We have to help them," Spark said. One checked their time. 45 minutes used, 75 minutes remaining. If they helped the civilians, they'd lose at least 15 minutes. The margin for error was slim. "Are you sure?" he asked. "You taught me that empathy isn't weakness. If we abandon them, we prove everyone right. We become exactly what they expect." One nodded, "Then we help them." They treated the holographic wounds using medical supplies from an emergency kit. They led the civilians to a safe zone. 15 minutes became 20. The time was slipping away. But something changed. The AI, programmed to adapt and learn, recognized their choice. A new path opened. The grateful civilians revealed a maintenance shaft that bypassed 40% of the remaining station. The route was dangerous but faster. Empathy had literally become the optimal tactical choice. "The simulation is rewarding us," Spark said, amazed. "No," one corrected. "The simulation is teaching. Real situations are complex. Sometimes the moral choice is also the strategic one." They pressed on, using the new route. But the final chamber presented the ultimate test. The core room was massive, and standing between them and the objective was Commander himself. He'd entered the simulation as a final boss, piloting a combat mech 3 times his normal size, armed with weapons that could level a building. "You cannot win, human's voice boomed through the mech speakers. "I know every tactic. I know your human tricks, and this AI has learned from everything you've done. Your mercy will be your downfall." The mech opened fire. One grabbed Spark and rolled behind cover. Weapons fire tore through metal like paper. They were outmatched and running out of time. "I have an idea," Spark said suddenly, "but you have to trust me." "Always," one replied. Spark explained quickly. It was risky. It required perfect timing, but it might work. They split up. One drew's attention, running between cover points, barely staying ahead of the mech's weapons. The AI controlling the station's defenses coordinated with, cutting off escape routes. They were herding one toward the core room center, toward the magnetic containment field that powered the station. That's exactly what Spark wanted. While focused on one, Spark circled around, small and unnoticed. The Cub reached the containment controls and waited. One led mech directly into position, right over the containment field generators. "Now," one shouted. Spark's horns vibrated at a specific frequency, one that had calculated would resonate with the containment field's magnetic coils. The field destabilized for just 3 seconds, but 3 seconds was enough. The mech systems went haywire, overwhelmed by magnetic interference. Tried to compensate, but the mech was dead in the air. Spark ran forward and manually triggered the core shutdown sequence. The simulation ended. Time remaining, 4 minutes. They'd won. The chamber dissolved back to reality. Medical teams rushed in. One had taken some hits and was bleeding from a shoulder wound. Spark was exhausted, barely able to stand. But they'd done it. They'd passed the crucible. The medical bay was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors. One lay in a recovery bed, his shoulder bandaged and healing under advanced medical technology. He'd been unconscious for 3 days, his body needing time to recover from the injuries sustained in the crucible. But he wasn't alone. Spark had not left his side for a single moment. The Cub lay curled on a mat next to the bed, exhausted but refusing to move. and one had tried to convince Spark to rest in proper quarters, but the young wouldn't budge. "I stayed with it when it needed me," Spark had said simply. "Now I stay with him." On the third day, Bora arrived with his personal camera device. He looked at the scene, the small cub sleeping protectively beside the human's bed, and something in his chest tightened. This was important. People needed to see this. He took a photograph and transmitted it along with a message. "This is what we have forgotten." When one finally woke, the first thing he saw was Spark's golden eyes watching him with relief and joy. "You're okay," the cub said, voice thick with emotion. "Of course I am," one said, his voice rough. "We're partners, remember. Can't let you face things alone." Spark climbed onto the bed and pressed against one's uninjured side. The human put his arm around the young. No words were needed. They'd been through something profound together, and it had changed them both. The next morning, the facility commander called an assembly. Every trainee, every instructor, every species representative gathered in the main auditorium. The air was thick with anticipation. Stood at a podium, looking nervous but determined. One and Spark sat in the front row, the cub refusing to be anywhere else. Began. "My job is to understand how different species work. During my research into physiology, I discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew." She projected genetic data onto the screens. Most people couldn't read the complex patterns, but the elders leaned forward, suddenly very interested. "They were not always the way they are now," continued. 10,000 years ago, your people were deeply empathetic. Your crystalline horns evolved not as weapons but as communication tools, allowing you to share emotions across distances. You were builders, artists, and philosophers." The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. Commander stood abruptly. "This is lies propaganda." "It's genetic fact," replied calmly. "During a war whose details are lost to history, your leaders made a choice. They genetically modified your entire species to suppress empathy, believing it made you weak. You won that ancient war, but you lost yourselves in the process." She highlighted a specific genetic sequence. "Spark is not defective. Spark is a genetic reversion, a throwback to what your people were before modification. Every trait you called weakness, empathy, mercy, emotional intelligence, those are your original nature." The silence in the auditorium was deafening. Warriors looked at each other, their worldview crumbling. Everything they'd believed about strength, about honor, about what it meant to be, was built on a foundation that might be false. High Mother Al, the ancient female elder, stood slowly. She was over 200 years old, the oldest in the chamber. Her voice was quiet but carried through the space. "My grandmother told me stories," she said. "Stories I thought were myths." She spoke of the old ones who could feel others' pain, who built instead of destroyed, who solved conflicts through understanding instead of combat. We dismissed these stories as children's tales, but what if they were memories? She descended from her seat and approached Spark. The entire chamber held its breath. The ancient elder knelt before the small cub, bringing her eyes level with Spark's. "Forgive us, little one," she said, and her voice cracked with emotion. "We called you broken when you were whole. We called you weak when you were complete. You are not defective, we are." Tears rolled down his face. One felt his throat tighten. Spark looked overwhelmed, not knowing how to respond to an apology from one so high in hierarchy. Bora stood from his seat. "I formally request permission to transfer to Instructor One's training program. I want to learn these methods. I want to remember what we were." "I also request transfer," another young warrior said, standing. Then another, and another. Within minutes, 12 warriors had requested transfer. The old ways were cracking. But Commander remained standing, his expression a storm of emotions. Finally, he approached one. The human stood to meet him, though towered over him by 2 feet. "I was wrong," said, and the words seemed to cost him everything. "I saw in Spark what I spent my life suppressing. Doubt, fear, empathy. I thought removing these made us strong. But watching you face the crucible, seeing that cub stand with you against impossible odds, I understand now. True strength is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to act despite it, not the absence of empathy. It is fighting to protect what you care about. He turned to Spark. You are braver than I have ever been, because you refused to become what we demanded. You remained yourself. The facility commander stood. In light of these revelations, the Council has made several decisions. Integrated training methods will be implemented across all facilities as an option alongside traditional programs. Instructor 1 will head the new program, and Spark is granted full student status with the right to choose their own path. The chamber erupted in applause, but it wasn't finished yet. Spark, High Mother Al said formally. In the old tongue, we had names of power, names not used since the modification. I believe you deserve such a name. We call you, which means one who bridges. You bridge past and future, tradition and change, what we were and what we might become again. Spark now stood tall. The cub was no longer ashamed or afraid. I accept this name, and I choose to continue training with one. Not because my people reject me, but because he helped me find myself. Months passed, the training facility transformed. Mixed species units became common. Traditional and integrated methods were taught side by side, instructors learning that neither was absolute. Some situations required force, others required finesse. The best warriors knew when to use which approach. Research sparked the Restoration Project. Thousands of volunteered to reverse the ancient genetic modifications, wanting to reconnect with their empathetic heritage. It was slow work taking years, but the society began to change. One's program grew. He taught not just combat but philosophy, not just tactics but ethics. His students came from every species, all seeking to learn this balance between strength and compassion. One day, a new class of trainees arrived. Among them were 3 young cubs who exhibited empathy. Their families had specifically requested one as instructor, seeing it not as a flaw to be fixed but a gift to be cultivated. During the first training session, facility alarms sounded for a standard drill. One walked toward the human assembly point. The 3 cubs, uncertain and afraid, instinctively moved toward him instead of the section. They clustered around his legs, seeking protection. One knelt down, bringing himself to their level. Now wearing an assistant instructor's badge, stood beside him. It's okay to be afraid, one told the young cubs. And it's okay to trust someone who makes you feel safe, even if they're different from you. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. His horns glowed softly, resonating with reassurance. The cubs relaxed, understanding on an instinctive level that they were safe here. This place was different. These instructors were different. That evening, one stood at his quarters viewport watching the stars. Joined him, now almost fully grown, strong and confident. I've been thinking about what you once told me, said, about empathy being a tactical advantage. And one asked, I think you were wrong. It's not just a tactical advantage. It's what makes us people instead of weapons. It's what gives us something worth fighting for. One smiled. You're right, I was thinking too small. You've surpassed me as a student should. No, corrected gently. I just learned what you already knew. You saved me not because it was tactically useful. You saved me because you couldn't walk away from someone who needed help. That's not strategy. That's character. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching ships come and go from the facility. The galaxy was changing, slowly but surely. Species that had isolated themselves were learning cooperation. Warriors who had known only aggression were discovering diplomacy. And at the center of it all was a simple truth. Different perspectives made everyone stronger. Years later, Captain commanded a Council fleet ship. The bridge crew a mix of species working in perfect coordination. On the dedication plaque were engraved 2 names, Captain and below it, trained by Commander 1, who taught us that trust is the first weapon and the last defense. One, now retired from active teaching but serving as a consultant, received regular messages from former students across the galaxy, sent updates weekly. Bora had become an instructor himself. The three cubs from that first integrated class were now officers in their own right. The species was still healing, still learning to balance their warrior heritage with their reclaimed empathy. It would take generations to fully integrate both aspects, but they were trying. That's what mattered. One message arrived that made one laugh until tears came to his eyes. It was from Commander, who had retired to a monastery where monks were studying the old ways. "You were right, human," the message said. "Strength without empathy is just violence. Empathy without strength is helplessness. True power is holding both and knowing when to use which. It took me 60 years to learn what you understood naturally. Perhaps humans are not as soft as we thought. Perhaps you are simply wise enough to remember what we forgot." One wrote back, "We all forget important things sometimes. The real strength is in choosing to remember. Thank you for having the courage to change." He looked at the photograph on his desk, the one Bora had taken years ago. A small cub sleeping protectively beside a human's hospital bed. That moment had changed everything. Not because it was strategic or tactical or politically calculated, but because it was genuine. Trust, freely given. Protection, freely offered. Love that crossed species barriers. That's what humanity brought to the galaxy. Not superior weapons or technology, but the simple reminder that kindness was not weakness, that mercy was not defeat, that choosing who you wanted to be was more important than accepting who you were told to be. And sometimes, the most revolutionary act was simply standing beside someone who needed you and saying, "I've got your back."